Good evening. I wish to talk to you this evening about the
state of the nation.
Ladies and gentlemen, to whom it concerns, it's
a great goal! That was a super goal!
Cantwell makes no mistakes from the spot, and Era wins 3-2.
Look at him! Look at him in anguish! Oh, look at the Spanish keeper in anguish!
Oh, it's so fast! It's so fast!
And up yours as well.
Hello, and welcome back to Irish Football Chronicles. It's been a very long time since I spoke to you last. I think our most recent episode was back in May. But this is just a special seasonal episode to tide you over the festive period. I know it's been a very difficult year for a lot of people. It's been an especially difficult Christmas for a lot of people. So if this episode contributes to the gaiety of life in any way, then that's what we're here for. I'm not going to pick up where I left off with the Italia 90 qualifiers. If you do want to hear me talk at considerable length about Italia 90, I was lucky enough to be invited onto the extratime.ie podcast. During the summer, they did a day-by-day series of Italia 90 podcasts, so you can listen back to that and get all the Italia 90 you could possibly need. Another thing that's happened since we were last together is that Jack Charlton obviously has passed away. And I know if you're a listener to this podcast, or if you're someone who's inclined even to listen to this podcast, Jack probably loomed as large in your life as he did in mine. So I also contributed a sort of a footballing obituary of Jack Charlton to extratime.ie. So I'll put the link in the show description, and you can check that out if you'd like. So this special seasonal tale weaves together two stories that took place in North Dublin over the Christmas period of 1957, and we'll be following them up into early 1958 as well. Our footballing port of call is the 1957-58 Leinster Senior Cup final between Shamrock Rovers and Drumcondra. Now, if you're not one of those people who's enraptured by the magic of the Leinster Senior Cup, do please still keep listening, because I think you'll find the events around this game particularly entertaining. The other strand of our story, well, if I tell you that an attendance of 20,000 at a Leinster Senior Cup game isn't nearly the strangest part of this episode, you'll have some idea what we're dealing with. I'll be telling the harrowing and somewhat forgotten, in fact entirely forgotten story of the Finglas Poltergeist, which terrorised a family and community in the North Dublin suburb over the winter of 1957 and 1958. But to begin with, let's look at the sort of world that these events took place in, and indeed the sort of Ireland that these events took place in. In September 1957, Oliver St. John Gogarty, who was himself a former Leinster Senior Cup winner with Bohemians, died of a heart attack in New York. While on Christmas Day, the day before that year's final, a newborn called Shane McGowan gave his first vocal performance to the midwives in the maternity unit at Pembury near Tunbridge Wells. So this episode takes place in the sort of no man's land between Joycean Dublin and punk rock, which is a hell of a place to be. But there was a lot more going on in the world at large, so here are just some of the sounds of 1957.
This story of the Russian satellite burst upon a startled world early in October. Russia announcing she had shot a man-made moon 560 miles into space, where it was circling.
Everybody knows was landing to the jail.
Wicked, insane, evil. Call Frankenstein what you will. A demon had made a man-made monster, and now the monster was the master.
The Atomic Energy Authority have announced that some uranium cartridges in the center of the atomic pilot wind scale became overheated yesterday. The authority have said that...
He speaks to Sabert, he crosses, and it's a goal! It's headed in by Atio in the last overtime.
That last clip you heard there, complete with intrusive RTE library music, was from the footballing story of the year in Ireland. That was John Atio's heartbreaking stoppage time equaliser for England against Ireland at Dalymount Park in May 1957. It was a game Ireland had to win to force a playoff against the English for a place at the 1958 World Cup, and Ireland led for 87 minutes until Atio's header brought Dalymount Park from fever pitch to deathly silence in a split second. As commentator Philip Green put it, you could hear the silence as far as Nelson's Pillar. Nelson's pillar itself, of course, was on borrowed time, but it was predeceased in this year of 1957 by the equestrian statue of Field Marshal Gough, which was blown off its plinth in the Phoenix Park in June, never to set foot in Ireland again. An interesting parallel with today, when we're again faced with the issue of contentious statues and what should be done with them. And again, just like today, Ireland was in the midst of a global pandemic which began in China, the notorious Asian flu of 1957-58. The pandemic was well into its second wave by the time this game took place, but a vaccine was already available and sporting fixtures went ahead in front of large crowds, although the authorities seemed far more willing to close schools than they appear to be now. The newspapers of the time are also full of advertisements recommending everything from Beecham's powder to Lucasade as surefire prophylactics against the Asian flu. One big difference with today, however, is that in 1957-58, the League of Ireland was still arguably just at its zenith. It was entirely commonplace to see League of Ireland players in the national team. Ronnie Nolan of Shamrock Rovers had played in that fateful game against England, and Alan Kelly of Drumcondra kept goal in the earlier 5-1 defeat at Wembley. Rovers and Drumcondra were two of the dominant teams of the time, although the honours were pretty well spread around, particularly with Pats joining the league in 1951 and immediately winning 3 championships in 5 years. Before we go any further though, we need to talk about what we talk about when we talk about the Dublin Derby. Nowadays everyone knows that Bohs Rovers is the Dublin Derby, but earlier in the century, Shells versus Rovers was the big rivalry, and by the late 1950s, Rovers versus Drumcondra was arguably the biggest of the lot. Not only was it North Side versus South Side, it was two of the most successful and fashionable teams in Irish football going head to head. Indeed, when the League of Ireland played the English Football League at Ellen Road in October of 1957, the team that went down 3-1 consisted almost entirely of Rovers and Drums players, and matches between the two would regularly attract 5-figure crowds to Milltown or Tolka Park. Rovers had pipped Drums to the league in the 56-57 season, and by the turn of the year the two teams were again tussling it out for the 57-58 championship. Now in those days Ireland obviously had a winter football season, so Yuletide football was no rarity, and the Leinster Senior Cup final on Stephen's Day was often the highlight of the programme. It's that game which provides the basis for today's episode, and I'll be telling you the full story in the second half of the episode. But first, we're going to pick up the other strand of our story, of the harsh Dublin winter of 57-58, the strange and disturbing case of the Finglas Poltergeist. Now, as regular listeners will know, I like to flavour the Christmas special with a little dash of the supernatural. The traditional Christmas ghost story is a staple of kind of festive folklore in these islands, but this tale is rather different, rather more disquieting. Festive ghost stories usually evoke cosy winter evenings around the fireplace, tales of haunted castles or ancient graveyards, or perhaps more commonly in this country, the nefarious doings of the fairy folk on country roads. But the story I have to tell you doesn't take place in an old manor house or a fairy fort or a dark and lonely stretch of bogland. It happened in a brand new council house in a brand new Dublin suburb, and the terrified people it happened to were quoted in major national newspapers under their own names. So this isn't second, third hand rumour and folklore stuff. This was all very real to the people it happened to and deeply traumatising. But before we delve into the story itself, I want to tell you a bit about where it happened. If you're not familiar with Finglas, it's a large suburb of Dublin about 4 miles from the city centre and just north of the Tolka River. Or at least that's how you'd describe it today. But up until the 1950s, Finglas had been a small country village on the rural fringe of Dublin. A village which had grown up around the site of an ancient monastery and hadn't really seen much action since King Billy camped his army there on his way to Dublin after his victory at the Boyne. By the 1950s, though, Finglas had been utterly transformed by new council housing developments, built to take the pressure off the city's chronic and eternal housing crisis. And it's here that our happy couple, Barry and Mary, enter the story. Now, just a note here, I'm not going to give their last names because if I have the right people, and I'm 99.999% sure I do, Barry only passed away this time last year, and my research suggests that the family still lives in the area, so we'll just refer to them as Barry and Mary throughout. There's another probably more tragic and serious reason why I won't give their surname, but we'll come to that later. Barry was from nearby Collins Avenue, so quite possibly a Drumcondra fan, and Mary was originally from Crumlin. Now, I want to emphasise again that these people weren't anonymous randomers chancing their arm in the paper. Barry came from a very well-known, well-connected Dublin theatrical family. He was also very closely related to Pater Carney, Brendan Behan, and in fact the late Jerry Ryan. Barry and Mary were quite the glamorous young couple, and both their engagement and wedding photos had featured on the front page of the Evening Herald. In 1957, Mary gave birth to their first child, and the couple passed a pleasant Christmas looking forward to moving into their new home in Finglas. And it was a very new home. It had only been built in January 1957. If Barry and Mary knew that at least one family had already moved in and quickly moved back out of the house, it didn't put them off. If they'd known exactly why, it might well have done. Now, none of the newspapers printed the actual address of the house, but they did print a picture of its very distinctive facade. I'm pretty familiar with Finglas, and I recognise the area almost straight away. Again, I won't give the name of the street because I know, or I strongly suspect, that some of the family still lives in the neighbourhood. Suffice to say, if you've ever been for a driving test in Finglas, you've probably passed the Poltergeist house without knowing it. I do not believe in ghosts, but I would not go into that house again for all the money in the world. That's what Mary told the Irish Independent in January 1958. What made a young mother flee from her dream home in absolute terror after just a few weeks? It all began innocuously enough. Soon after they moved into the house, Barry and Mary would occasionally notice that their child's cot had changed position, that doors that had been locked were found to be unlocked, trivial things like that. They put it down to absent-mindedness and the excitement of moving into a new home, even when the steel bars of their baby's cot appeared to have been bent by a tremendous weight, only to regain their shape by the morning. There was also the curious odour of the place, a strange musty smell that Barry was surprised to find in a brand new house. As their friend John had joked when they were moving in the furniture, there must be a corpse buried somewhere. But one Friday night in January 1958, something happened which was impossible to ignore. As Barry left to drop his father's car back to Collins Avenue, Mary heard the dining room door lock fast behind her. At first she thought Barry was kidding around and went to look out the rear window. When she looked back into the kitchen, she saw that her sweeping brush, which had been resting in a corner of the room, had suddenly materialised beside her. That was perplexing enough, but to her horror, Mary then heard footsteps skidding across the floor of the upstairs bedroom, the bedroom in which her 6-month-old son lay sleeping. Trapped behind a locked door, with her baby son at the mercy of, well, who knew what, she began to scream for her husband. Fortunately, Barry hadn't yet set off, and hearing her cries, he rushed back into the house to find the dining room door locked from the outside. Barry forced the door open and raced in to calm his wife before the two of them went to check on their son, who, fortunately, was exactly where they left him, still asleep. It was the last night Mary would ever spend in the house. Now, as I say, it was pretty unusual in the Ireland of the 1950s, still a deeply religious country, to go on record with an experience like this. But Barry and Mary were both happy to be named in the newspapers. Again, I want to emphasise that these weren't fanciful people who frightened easily. He may have come from a theatrical background, but Barry worked as a bookbinder with Alex Tom & Co. in Glasnevin, printers of the famous Tom's Directory of Dublin. He was also a fitness fanatic and a well-known amateur boxing coach. Nonetheless, he was, by his own admission, sufficiently spooked by what was going on in his new home to seek solace from the church. Barry went to his local priest, fully expecting to be laughed out of the room. Instead, the priest gave him 2 pieces of advice. Firstly, he advised Barry to talk about his experiences. As Barry said, he said it would be a good way to get the thoughts of it out of my system. But the priest's second piece of advice was more to the point and more chilling. Get out of that house now and stay out. That night, with Mary and the baby safely packed off to her mother in Crumlin, Barry and his neighbour John kept a wary vigil in what the newspapers would dub the House of Fear. John, like Barry, wasn't easily spooked. He worked on the Dublin docks, a tough physical job in the days before containerisation, and in fact he brought his docker's grappling hook with him to Barry's house just in case, as he put it, anything came at us. John and Barry settled down for a tense, lonely Saturday night in what the papers described as a remote part of Finglas. Now that may seem absurd today when Finglas is a bustling suburb of 30,000 people, but back in 1958 it was still considered part of County Dublin, and Barry's house was on the very eastern fringe of the new development. There was no roar of traffic from the M50, no blaze of lights in every direction. It would be another decade before the steepling tower blocks of Ballymun sprang up on the dark, silent fields to the east. Instead, through a long night in the bleakest stretch of the year, John and Barry found themselves huddling around a dim nightlight in the bedroom of an isolated house miles from the clamour of Dublin's docklands or the bright lights of its dance halls where they felt safe and at home. They were nervous, tense, and alone. Or at least, they hoped they were alone. In fact, nothing happened that first night, but with Mary still refusing to set foot in the house, Barry and John decided to sit vigil again the following evening. This time, John secured the baby's cot, which seemed to be the focus of so much of the activity, with his heavy grappling hook just in case it should go wandering again. As the night wore on, Barry, wiped out by the stress of the past few weeks, began to doze off. At 2 a.m, he was rudely awakened by a nudge from his friend. John had heard a tapping noise echo through the room, and now the cot had started to creak. And then it started to move. Still tethered to John's grappling hook, the cot glided out into the centre of the room. Immediately Barry started to panic. He sprang up and began sprinkling holy water around the room. In the name of God, he demanded, "Who are you and what do you want?" There was, of course, no response. But the act of sprinkling the water calmed Barry down a bit, and the two men made themselves busy, as men like to do when they don't want to admit how scared they are. They replaced the nightlight with a 100-watt bulb, but suddenly stopped in their tracks. There were noises, loud, clear noises, coming from downstairs. The sound was unmistakable. It was the scrape of the dining room table being dragged, physically dragged, across the bare, uncarpeted floorboards. Next, they heard the dining room door open and quickly slam shut. Then came the footsteps. They were shuffling, John remembered to the papers, as if wearing slippers, and it sounded as though someone was carrying a heavy load. They came right up to the bedroom door and seemed to stop outside the adjoining bedroom door. Then Barry heard the sound that had become so familiar during his ordeal, the rapid clicking on-off, on-off, on-off of the light switch. There was in fact no bulb in the spare bedroom, but this didn't deter whatever it was from going through the same routine 3 more times, shuffling up the stairs, stopping outside the door, and flicking the light switch on and off, on and off. Grappling hook or no grappling hook, boxing coach or no boxing coach, neither John nor Barry felt brave enough to open the door and confront whatever might be outside. They left well enough alone, feeling protected by the holy water splashed about the bedroom. They kept watch until daylight when, exhausted and relieved with no further cause for alarm, they both fell asleep. And that was the last night Barry ever spent in the house. It was a lovely house, he told the Herald, but I would rather be beaten up by 20 men than go through that fortnight again. His friend John told a similar story. For 4 nights afterwards, he told the Irish Independent, I wasn't able to sleep and I wouldn't go outside in the dark without someone with me. So, those are the facts in the case of the Finglas poltergeist, as related by the couple themselves and their stalwart friend to the newspapers of the time. Barry did go on record in the Independent saying that much of what had appeared in the papers had been fabricated or exaggerated, and that no one other than himself and John had kept watch in the house, despite some very detailed claims to the contrary by other people. After Barry and Mary vacated the premises, it became something of a tourist attraction on the rather lonely and underserviced eastern edge of Finglas. One Saturday night, a group of men turned up to inspect the House of Fear. A downstairs window shattered that evening, but that seems more likely to have been due to local rowdies acting the bollocks than anything else. In fact, neighbours wryly commented that they were far more scared of the groups of young men coming to look at the house than of any ghost that might dwell within. Barry and Mary put into Dublin Corporation for a transfer, and as far as I can tell, they eventually settled down very close to the site of the alleged haunting. As I said earlier, I'm not going to give too much detail about the family because obviously they still live in the area, but also they suffered a number of tragedies in the years after these events. And indeed, Barry was indirectly involved in a tragic event which still surfaces in the news right up until the present day. That said, the family went on to become very well known and liked in the area, particularly in sporting circles, and Barry's passing in 2019 was heavily mourned by his neighbours. As for the house itself, well, in the wake of Barry and Mary's departure and all the publicity around it, Dublin Corporation did what it usually does in those circumstances. It covered everything up, literally in this case. One snowy morning in early 1958, a group of workmen arrived to seal up the house, doors, windows and all, with heavy sheets of corrugated iron. The ESB and the gas company were also called out to cut off supply. Looking for a scoop, the Irish Pictorial, which was a short-lived magazine of the late 1950s, assembled a team of paranormal experts and offered to rent or even buy the house off the corporation, but the corpo were having none of it. There's been too much publicity already, a spokesman told the Irish Pictorial. All this publicity is leaving the house on our hands. We've invested a lot of money in that house. I don't believe in ghosts. I'd be willing to spend a night in that house to prove this is nothing but superstitious nonsense. The house will remain closed, said the corpo, until someone who is in need of accommodation and is willing to pay the rent of 43 shillings a week applies for it. Such an application will be sympathetically considered. Whoever lives in the Finglas House of Fear today, they're almost certainly unaware of its past, and that's probably for the best. It is in some ways a window onto a more civilised time in Dublin, when not only was there new council housing to move into, but tenants could put in for a transfer without being monstered in the right-wing media. Anyway, we'll leave the story of the Finglas poltergeist in the archives, where it's lain pretty much undisturbed for over 60 years, and get on with the festive football. Now, where were we? The Drums versus Rovers in the Leinster Senior Cup final of 1957-58. In actual fact, this was one of 12 Rovers versus Drumcondra Cup finals, not counting replays, that were played between 1953 and 1958, spread across the FAI Cup, the League of Ireland Shield, the Dublin City Cup, the Top 4 Cup, and of course the Leinster Senior Cup. It's a bit of an in-joke today, but the Leinster Senior Cup was still a pretty big deal in the 1950s. I suppose it was still trading off the reputation it had gained before partition, when Irish football was dominated by northern teams, and the Leinster Senior Cup was really the one big occasion that was guaranteed to involve at least one of the major Dublin clubs. As I say, it was still quite highly prized in the late 50s, its prestige having survived the 1946-47 final when Bohs beat Grange Gorman 11-0. The 57-58 competition began in early September, with Lingus beating Chapelizod and UCD defeating St James's Gate. By the way, quick little story about the Gate. The week after the UCD game, James's Gate took on Lingus in the Leinster Senior League and lost 3-2 despite striker Brian Keeley hitting the crossbar 5 times in the match. As for our two teams, Rovers began their campaign in the third round with a handy 3-0 win over Dundalk at Tolka Park. Why Tolka Park? Well, because from the third round onwards, most of the Leinster Senior Cup games were played under lights on Wednesdays at Drumcondra's home ground of Tolka Park. Tolka was, at the time, the only venue in the league with floodlights, which their wealthy owners, the Proles, had installed in 1953. It would be 1960 before the famous pylons sprang up around Dalymount Park. So that was another reason for the continuing popularity of the Leinster Senior Cup. Midweek floodlit football was a real novelty for the Dublin football public. In fact, all 4 quarter-finals were played over successive Wednesday evenings in November at Tolka Park. Drums beat St Pat's 3-2 in a cracking game, before Shells racked up a thrilling 4-3 win over Home Farm. In the third quarter-final, Transport beat Longford Town 3-1 in front of a tiny crowd, but Bows vs Rovers attracted a healthy attendance to Tolka Park for the last quarter-final. Rovers legendary player-manager Paddy Code missed the game, having contracted the Asian flu we mentioned earlier, but a goal from Paddy Ambrose put Rovers into the semi. And in those semis, Drumcondra saw off Shells 3-2 in an epic game in front of a Wednesday night crowd of 8,000, while Rovers hammered Transport 6-1 with Noel Payton, who was being watched by Leeds, who he'd signed for, scoring 4 goals in a game very few people actually saw. Not because no one turned up, but because Tolka's 60,000 watt floodlights were no match for the dense, smothering fog that rolled across the Tolka and almost got the game abandoned. And so the scene was set for yet another Drums vs Rovers final, this one to be played on Stephen's Day 1957 at Dalymount Park. As Edmund Hillary and Sir Vivian Fuchs converged on the South Pole, 20,000 spectators converged on Dalymount for this match, with many, many more tuning in via Radio Éireann's live radio coverage. Again, 20,000 people at a Leinster Senior Cup final live on RTE. The past truly is a foreign country. The game might have attracted even more fans if it hadn't clashed with the absurdly popular Dublin Dog Show at Cathal Barracks. The entertainment itself was worthy of the occasion. At Dalymount, that is. I don't know about the Dog Show. Drums took the lead on 15 minutes when Tommy Rowe met Dermot Cross's centre to head past Eamon Sheila Darcy in the Rovers' goal. The lead only lasted 15 minutes though before Burke touched the ball to Liam Hennessy, who drilled one past Alan Kelly from just inside the box. The second half was a thrilling affair. Drums dominated, winning 9 corners, but Rovers were always dangerous on the counter, with Toohey and Hamilton both going close. The big crowd, however, would have to be content with a 1-1 draw for their festive entertainment in a game neither side really deserved to lose. Now, you might think I raced through that a bit for a game that's meant to be the main focus of our story, but I'm really more interested in what happened after the match. Obviously, a replay was going to be required, but in some absolutely classic League of Ireland behaviour, Rovers made such a fuss over the replay being played at Drum's home ground of Tolka Park that the disputes dragged on well into the new year. In fact, the dispute was nowhere near resolved by the time Drumcondra took on Rovers on January 26th in one of the most anticipated League of Ireland games ever. It was a game Rovers really needed to win to stay in the title race, and interest was at fever pitch. This was the first ever all-ticket League of Ireland game, but while everyone expected a great and probably decisive occasion, no one could have anticipated the chaos that lay ahead. The official attendance at the game was 19,053, but whether Drum's chairman Roy Prole had underestimated the interest in the game or overestimated Tolka's capacity, the turnstiles were quickly overrun and very nearly demolished. Fans gained admittance by clambering over walls and knocking down fences, and the game kicked off with supporters lining the touchlines. Referee on the day was Sergeant Tommy Cannon, son of Bows legend Captain Harry Cannon. Now, Cannon had only just been elevated from the junior ranks, so it seemed an extraordinary decision to give him such a big, high-pressure game, and he would come in for a lot of criticism. No one had any complaint with the first half, though, which was a fantastic exhibition of football dominated by Rovers. Alan Kelly held their attacks at bay until Ronnie Nolan pulled down a throw-in the 35th minute and fired under Kelly for the lead goal. And then just before half-time, Rovers took a 2-0 lead against a Drums side reduced to 10 by injury. There were no subs in those days. Hamilton played in code and Kelly was never getting near his fireball of a shot. Now, subsequent newspaper reports pointed the finger at the referee for allowing the teams a break at half-time instead of turning them straight around, which seems harsh, especially as the game actually resumed in pretty good order. 11 minutes into the second half, Drums were back in the match. Shea Kyo brought down Coleman in the Rovers box and Stan Pownell slammed home the penalty. Now the game and the league title and the crowd was on a knife edge. Another Drums goal might well secure them the championship, but if Rovers could hold on against the 10 men, they were right back in it. But on 65 minutes, the incident that would bring Tolka Park to boiling point and beyond. Tommy Hamilton was slipped in by Noel Payton and tripped under pressure from Alan Kelly. Hamilton stumbled into the human wall on the touchline and was swiftly swallowed up by it. In the confusion, referee Cannon gave an unclear signal. Was it a penalty, a goal kick, a corner? And then all hell broke loose. Supporters spilled onto the field from all directions. The small Garda presence did little to deter them, and Drumcondra chairman Roy Prohl took it upon himself to reef a couple of youngsters off the field, which was a spectacularly bad idea. He was swiftly engulfed in a cocoon of swinging fists and had to show a fair turn of speed to escape intact, hurtling over several attempted trips as he made for the pavilion. While the crowd was busy with Prohl, referee Sergeant Cannon retreated to the dressing room in rather better order. By now, Tolka Park belonged to the mob. With thousands of fans swarming across the pitch, Sergeant Cannon had little choice but to abandon the game. When word reached the crowd that the game would not resume, things threatened to turn ugly or uglier. Fans surrounded the dressing room, singing and chanting abuse at the beleaguered Sergeant Cannon. They eventually dispersed, but the reaction was predictably scathing. Above all, people wondered, how could the Leinster Senior Cup final replay go ahead with a nighttime kick-off in Tolka Park when the ground couldn't safely accommodate all those who wanted to see it? Again, different country. The Leinster Football Association condemned the disgraceful scenes at Tolka Park. They promised a massive Garda presence at the replay and talked about limiting the crowd. It was only confirmed that the game would go ahead at Tolka Park on the 4th of February, the day before the match was due to take place. Another large crowd was expected, and as Vincent Mathers put it in the Irish press, when the lights go out at Tolka Park tonight and soccer fans go home to bed, one dressing room under the stands will echo to the ecstasies of a team dipped in the joys of victory. You'd have to wonder if a young Damien Richardson was reading the press that day and taking notes. Anyway, the replay went ahead as planned under lights at Tolka on Wednesday the 5th of February. In front of yet another big crowd, an exciting game was settled by a goal in the 15th minute when Liam Toohey dispossessed John O'Neill and blasted a shot past Alan Kelly. Both O'Neill and Kelly, incidentally, would shortly move to Preston North End and have a great deal of success there. Drumcondra pressed and pressed, chopped and changed their formation and lineup, but they just couldn't find an equaliser. With the turkey and tinsel long forgotten, this festive epic finally reached its conclusion with Rovers winning the Leinster Senior Cup yet again. In fact, you know those 12 Rovers Drums Cup finals I told you about earlier? This was one of the 11 that Rovers ultimately won. Although it was a lively and entertaining match, it was very swiftly forgotten, or probably more accurate to say it was overtaken by events, because another game took place that night, under lights, a 3-3 draw between Red Star Belgrade and Manchester United. Within a few hours, the devastating news came through that Manchester United's return flight had crashed while taking off from Munich. 6 of the players who had entertained the multitudes in that epic Ireland-England game at Dalymount would ultimately lose their lives, including Ireland's Liam Whelan. But to do his memory justice, we'll need to talk another day. Just to wrap up the story of that season, Drumcondra did actually hold on to win the championship, but obviously that they were on borrowed time as a football club themselves. But again, story for another day. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you're having a tolerable Christmas. I hope you're doing your very best to enjoy the season and to make time for yourself. Time that I think all of us enjoy after a very difficult, traumatic year. Keep looking out for one another and keep looking out for Irish Football Chronicles. Remember, you can get in touch with us at 100 Irish Games on Twitter, at Irish Football Chronicles on Facebook, or at 100irishgames@gmail.com. And if you've enjoyed listening, please do share the podcast. Post about it. Just otherwise get the word out. It all helps. All being well, I hope to speak to you again soon. Please have a great Christmas. It's not over yet. And wring every last minute of peace and joy that you can possibly wring out of it. It's been an incredibly tough year. And as I said, you deserve it. Take care. Happy Christmas and goodbye.
And up yours as well.